Hola, ¿qué tal? Pues bienvenidos a un podcast más de neurociencia para vivir mejor. Hoy estamos muy contentos porque tenemos a un invitado especial de Canadá, el doctor Edward Fernandes de la Universidad Barton College de Estados Unidos. Thank you very much, Eddie, for accepting my invitation to participate in this podcast.
You're quite welcome.
The topic that we are talking today is actually quite interesting. It's about relationships, it's about monogamy, it's about non-monogamous consensual relationships. Who better than Eddie, who is an expert in human psychology and sexual behavior, to explain to us in lay language what is going on with this interesting topic in different cultures, and of course, what can we obtain from this topic and probably apply it to our lives in the sense that we believe applies or not to our lives. Eddie, I would like to start with this question. Normally in biology and in all these courses that we are taught at universities, we categorize species according to different biological markers. For instance, if one male lives with different females, if the testicles of this male are big enough to produce sufficiently sperm, if there is sufficient sexual dimorphism that makes the male bigger than the female. Many of the biologists consider all these features as sufficient evidence to categorize a species as either with certain types of reproductive behavior. So my first question, I'd like to start with a hard one for you, is according to what all you know, how would you categorize human species in all this potential repertoire of reproductive strategies that exist out there in nature?
I'd say, first of all, that we must understand that we are primates. So we fit within the primate category per se. And like you suggested, even within the primate categories, there are many different variations in terms of the relationship between males and females vis-a-vis reproduction, protection, and survival. That's one of the things that we basically look at overall. In terms of our sexual expectations as a primate species, we fit within, the medium category, as you suggested. We don't have very large gonads, but we don't have very small gonads. Also, the length of the penises of the human male tends to be much larger in when we compare it to other primates. So these things basically tell us that we are a sort of which is traditionally categorized as a semi-monogamous species, meaning that we form pair bondings, and those pair bondings are designed specifically for procreation and for the care of the young, therefore continuation of the species. So that, I think, basically answers your question where we are. We're sort of in the middle of everything. Now, if you take the concept of evolutionary biology, for instance, we have to add the social context, which also makes us a little bit different from other primates, because we do have the capacity to form much, much, much larger social groups. You know, we're supposed to be in groups of about 120, 150 people, and yet we look at a city like Tokyo with close to 20 million people. So you have to take the social into account. I hope answers your question.
Yes, perfect. You know, very few days ago, I was a bit saddened because one of the professors that I know from very many years ago, Professor Larry Young, passed away. And he was expert in trying to discover the neurobiology behind pair bonds. And he was using small animals that you might be familiar with, that is called Microtus ocrogaster, prevost. What he found in all these years, along with many other great scientists, is that the brains of monogamous species are somehow hardwired to be ready to form bonds after cohabitation or sex or even stress. There are catalyzers of this bonding phenomena that occur in the brain. Humans, we also have this potential to form bonds and to stay with someone sometimes forever and live lives forever. But we have this tendency in many cultures of having extramarital encounters. And I would like to ask you, what is the paradox that you see in this biological potential that we as humans have, and all these behaviors that occur apparently in everybody?
Well, we can look at it from two different perspectives to start off with, I think. First of all, we can look at the evolutionary perspective, which I think that has to be taken into account, and quite often these days is not taken into account seriously, but it should be. First of all, what is the role of sex? You talked about prairie wolves, which is the wolves, I should say, which is an animal that is studied ad nauseum. But when we look at humans, what is the purpose of sex? Sex is meant for two categories. One often we're talk about, and the other one we don't. The very first function of sex is reproduction, correct? We have to reproduce. We pass on our genes. The second function of sex is pleasure, and we tend to ignore that. And when you talk about the brain biology, it's so important to understand the role of pleasure in human brain biology, because it motivates us to do all kinds of different things. Now, societies tend to be organized, or they were organized to a certain extent, into a sort of a monogamous pair bonding, meaning that male meets female, male reproduces with female, male now takes care of the offspring, male provides for the female, and it's all hunky-dory, correct? No, it's not. Because male now reproduced, passed on, look at another female that has particular characteristics that stimulates his imagination, and male now goes and procures the other female for what they call casual encounters. So we have to look at all of it in sort of in a larger picture, and that explains the reason why non-monogamy has always existed. I mean, if you look look throughout history at the fact that certain rulers in certain societies would have one wife, two wives, three wives, 20 concubines, 50 concubines. So what is the role of the concubine? It's not necessarily to produce offspring, but to provide pleasure. So we have to really consider pleasure as perhaps one of the biggest motivators of why we have sex. As I would say to my students often, if it hurt, nobody would do it. Correct? Right. So if there isn't pleasure involved, we need the motivator of reproduction, and that is not sufficient.
Sometimes the hard thing to accept in different cultures is to separate these two things that you're proposing: sex for reproduction and sex for pleasure. And in the moment that we're trying to separate it, we start thinking that it's immoral or it's incorrect. But biology is telling us that is exactly the opposite. Is one of the purposes that probably all these mechanisms evolved, you know?
I would often say to my students, there is no good or there is no bad. There's only a perception of good and a perception of bad. So you touched on something that is really important, that what we call morality. A lot of the sexual morality was brought about to prevent the separation of the dyad or the couple. Because, I mean, let's face it, we often look at the Romans as sort of an example. Oh, Romans had Roman orgies. What does that mean? Well, they basically had parties, let's call it, and which people engaged in sexual activity with many people. Was that meant to reproduce? No, of course not. It was all for pleasure. So the role of pleasure has been always really most significant when we consider sexual relationships, but it's always been put on the back burner, as it were, not important, but it's extremely important. We know for a fact from research that in societies in which adultery is punishable by death, people still commit adultery.
Wow.
So the question is, so if you actually know that you could actually be killed because you engage in a minutes or even hours of pleasure, that wouldn't make any sense, but people still do it. So it is a very strong motivator, I think, that we traditionally tend to ignore because, like you say, we apply morality, which then brings the question, what is morality?
Right. It comes to my mind one of the films called Caligula. You probably watched it. This is a crazy one that explains very well what you're talking about. And the other one is Troy. That explains very well how, starting with two people falling in love and desiring each other, starts all this war that we know about, right? And many other things that have happened more recently. For instance, presidents lying about not having sex with someone when they believe that oral sex is not sex, is not real sex. You know what I mean?
He did a lot for cigars.
Right. So yeah, Eddie. So non-monogamous consensual relationships exist in different cultures, but the questions before we start to discussing what are they. First, I would like to ask if it's the same for men or women. Are we equally interested in non-monogamous consensual relationships, or is mainly men who are interested? And if that tells you something about our biology.
I'm going to give you the simple answer to that, and then I'm going to explain why it's not simple. The simple answer is yes. Now, we also have to take into consideration what do we mean by let's call it extramarital or consensual non-monogamous relationships. What do people get out of it? I think traditionally, as I learned, and as you learn, that sort of from an evolutionary perspective, women have much more to lose if they engage in multiple sex with multiple males. And the explanation was always, well, women have one egg, men have 5 million sperms. We can sort of spread it around, and we have the ability to create more offsprings that way. A woman only has a chance to create one offspring, whatever. So that's from the evolutionary biological perspective. However, when we start looking at the pleasurable aspect of it, women are probably much more likely to enjoy sex pleasurably and in a pleasurable sense, much more so than men, because women are much more sexual than we are. I like to give quick explanations or examples, and they're sort of as a starting point to a conversation. Men can ejaculate one time, and then after that, you got to wait for a while. And sometimes a while could be days. Correct? Women can ejaculate, and women can orgasm many, many times. And depending on the woman and depending on the circumstances and whatnot. So when it comes to looking at consensual non-monogamy, one of the things that I was interested in finding out is exactly what you asked. I wanted to know, so is this a man-dominated world? Is this that men want to get off and therefore they drag their wives or girlfriends into it and they sort of force them into doing all of these things? And what I found was actually quite amazing and quite sensational for me is that, no, it's women. Actually, non-monogamy is women-driven, not man-driven.
Wow.
The swingers, and of course, swingers is the group that I study. Well, that's what we call them, swingers. Basically, the swingers have the saying that man get women into swinging. Women keep men in swinging.
Yeah.
So the question that is, why? Why is that so? And then I've interviewed thousands and thousands of people, and there's a consensus in terms of the answers that I get, because women can have much more fun in terms of their interactions from just a pleasurable perspective than men can. Men are very driven. Men are goal driven. Women are voyage driven. That makes sense to you.
Right. Right.
Right.
Well, what an interesting data you're mentioning. I would like to we have 5 minutes before we have to make the first cut, but I would like to ask you, this is a topic that many myths are around the idea of non-consensual monogamous. What would be the main myths that you would tell people that is probably not true of what we think about it?
First of all, the first myth there is, it's male driven.
Okay.
And the second myth is that it is going to solve all the problems in your relationship.
Right.
It's not. It's much more complicated than that. And we can talk about that at some point if you like.
Would you say that consensual non-monogamous is definitely not for everybody?
I would say definitely not for everybody. Absolutely. Because you take into consideration that we're talking about us as a species. We're primates, correct?
Right.
But every single one of us is different from each other.
Right.
We all think differently. We all have different motivations. We even have different sexual levels, for that matter. Some people are happy having sex once a year. Some people are very happy having sex 10 times a day. And there's nothing wrong with either one of them. So that's one of the myths, that this is all about go, 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 and everything's going to be cool. That's a myth.
And considering all these mechanisms that we were discussing in the beginning about dopamine, vasopressin, oxytocin, all these molecules that exist in our brain, and chances are that if the correct mechanisms are produced, we're going to develop pair bonds with someone. What about feelings of having preferences or falling in love with someone in these non-consensual consensual relationships? And where does it take to people to either enjoy or suffer about the consequences of participating? For example, I'm wondering if people suffers from jealousy by going and attending to the swinger parties and sharing their partner with someone else.
I think that is perhaps one of the biggest obstacles that a lot of the, let's call them swingers for the sake of argument here, that they face. And I've done probably thousands of workshops and talks to swinger conventions and swinger clubs and whatnot. And this is one of the things that I think that I spend quite a bit of time talking about. If you are not sure, or if you tend to be jealous, then this is probably not for you. Because feelings of jealousy are going to bring about feelings of resentment. And when resentment enters a relationship, you may as well put a knife to it because it's dead. Right. I don't care how much therapy you have, it's not getting there. So jealousy, to me, was always one of the questions that most intrigued me. Because although I've never been really jealous myself too much, but I've had some jealousies based on relationships that I had in the past and whatnot. And I would always question, why am I jealous? And the question then is, why are people jealous? Because people are not secure in their relationship. Traditionally, men tend to have a much more dire attitude towards possessiveness. Men like to possess things.
Right.
It's mine. You can't have it.
Right.
And Then the other part is the insecurity that is promoted by jealousy, specifically amongst men, And there is the fact that what if she enjoys sex more with somebody other than me? Is she going to leave me for that person? What if that individual has a bigger penis than me, or he can do better things, or can bring her to orgasm more times or in different ways? So there's a sense of insecurity that is attached to that jealousy. And if it persists, then my advice was always, if that is the case, get out of it.